I believe so. Thanks so much, Heidi. It's a pleasure for us to be with you today. It's great because the webinar, it becomes such a national event. The Regional Lab Northeastern Islands asked me to do a webinar next month for the U.S. Virgin Islands and thought it would be much better to do that one in person, but this one makes sense because you're all over. Let me begin, and Diana and I will play tag team. So let us begin, and please think about this, but you can also put anything in the chat pod. How many of you are actually implementing a data culture in your school or your district? And we have a couple of questions here and polls, so we'd like you to fill those out. We've made good progress. What do you think about those questions? So far as the answers are coming in, things are looking positive, very positive. As you all are finishing up and answering this, I'm looking at the second question about the structures needed to enable teachers. Still, about a fifth of you are saying no to that. And if you could put in the chat pod, the chat pod, anything to elaborate on, where your challenges are, what are your impediments, we'd really like to hear that. It's good to know that for those responding, and it is a fairly small number, that people are using their data to inform in the classroom for instruction. So this is heartening. Heidi, I think we're pretty good so far. Shall we move on past the poll? Thank you very much. So we're going to take both a very high-level view today, and we're going to try and get down into the weeds. Diana, coming from the perspective of being out there in the weeds, working with practitioners, she knows very intimately what goes on, and I'm a researcher, so I'm looking at it from the 30,000-foot level. And as you'll see, there's a running theme of safari animals in this presentation. So first, let us use the definition that comes from the practice guide that was published in 2009. What actually is data-driven decision-making? And many people talk about data-based, data-informed. Some people don't like the term driven. Data-based decision-making in education refers to teachers, principals, administrators systematically collecting and analyzing various types of data, including demographic, administrative, so on and so forth. And I want to stress the importance of the diversity of data here, keeping in mind that the most prolific source of data in the classroom is likely to be assessments and student performance data, but it's also important in order to have a comprehensive understanding of a child to have many other sources of data that include things like perception, climate, behavior, medical, attendance, those sorts of sources of data. And it's about making the data actionable on which to make the decision. So a question of why is it important? And there are many reasons. For the past decade or more, at least at the federal level and also in many states, policymakers are really emphasizing the importance of making education an evidence-based or a data-based practice. There's also been a philosophical shift. As many of you who are in the trenches in various positions in an education agency know, a lot of data are for compliance and accountability, But there is an emerging shift about continuous improvement, and Heidi mentioned it earlier on, the whole idea of continuous improvement for every child, for every classroom, for every school, for every district. So those data being actionable to improve children's learning. Data and evidence, this whole practice of being evidence-based is not just about gut feelings. And I don't want to eschew the notion that experience and anecdotes and those sorts of data are not relevant to educators, because good teachers, good administrators have been using data forever. But what really is happening now is a push for all sorts of data. You need hard evidence from which to make decisions, just as in other professions like medicine, in business, so on and so forth. And it's been around for a long time. It's not that people can just close their classroom doors and it's going to go away. It is here to stay. But the bottom line of all of this is our emphasis on helping teachers to help all children learn at their own pace. The question about why now, or why has it been emerging, there are several reasons for this. One is the proliferation of different sources of data. As you all know, you're bombarded with data, and many people think that data as well as time are the two big four-letter words in education, but diverse sources of data. Another reason is because of the emergence of technological solutions, whether they're big data systems that might be at the district or the state level, down to handheld devices and data dashboards that can be in the hands of educators to have real-time data readily available to them. An emerging issue is about data capacity. Take, for example, every state now has what's called a statewide longitudinal data system. The federal government has expended over $600 million on those data systems, yet very little attention and money have been devoted to building the human capacity to use those systems and address the need. So resources that the regional labs provide, the comprehensive centers, the kinds of professional development that Diana and her colleagues at Turk do, go to speak to the building of human capacity. And one of the things that we're working on now is helping schools of education to prepare at the pre-service level and those coming back for recertification and continuing education to build human capacity around that. But there's still many challenges, no matter whether you have the technological solutions, whether you've got well-trained educators, there are still many challenges, and a lot of it is about time and emphasis and competing priorities in schools. But just to give you some sense of the high-level emphasis on data-driven decision-making, here are two quotes, one by the current Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and the second one by John Easton, who until a couple months ago was the director of the Institute for Education Sciences, who funds research in education and the regional labs. And what you see from these two quotes is really a high-level policymaker emphasis on the importance. The fact that John Easton says that the best way to improve schools is through the use of data and data analysis. And he did that when he was involved with the Chicago Public Schools, as did Arne Duncan when he was the chief of the Chicago Public Schools. So it's not new, been around for a long time. Those of you who may have heard me speak before, I use a safari metaphor in which I watch trackers in Africa collecting all sorts of data, broken branches, trampled grass, hoof prints, and even picking up little pieces of poop to find out what the species, what had eaten, what gender. Those are data. They've been around for centuries. So the use of data has been around in education. It's emerging. It's important. But the use of data in all sorts of situations has been around for a long time. Diana, over to you for our first look at a video.
6 years ago, when I came to Harvard Park, the building was in crisis on a number of levels.
You're new at this, but you can do it. Go. Good.
Teacher morale was extremely low, behavior was out of control, and test scores were in the gutter. Now we have a 92% attendance rate, and over time our test scores have improved dramatically.
Student is there. Stop. 68 words. 68 words.
Oh my goodness. Every decision we make in this building is around data. What is the data telling us that's working right? What is the data telling us that's not working? And what are our next steps going to be? During our regular monthly assessment, we discovered that 80% of our students in second grade were performing below grade level in reading, math, and writing.
11 yellow.
Is this where they were at the beginning of the year? Okay.
Where they are, yet you can see.
Carrie's pulled in a few resources. We've tried to pull in resources ourselves to help us out, and it's just a big struggle with the low scores.
What each one of them are doing, you know, and who. So, I mean,
my goal this year is to get 95% of our students proficient in both reading and math.
Take away 7?
Yes. We're currently at 65%. 30% is going to take a lot of hard work.
Is 3/4 bigger than a half, or is 3/4 smaller than a half?
3/4. Now think about that, guys. Say what you just said. If you have 2/4 and that makes a half. If you have another one, that would take up half of the other half. So that means
correct.
it would be bigger.
Correct. You guys get what he's saying?
Yeah.
Awesome job, boys. Good.
The single most important factor for children to be successful is the classroom teacher.
What word? Look at the word. What word?
Teeth.
Without excellent classroom instruction, nothing else will matter.
What word?
10.
Okay, so
the main problem is our children are not comprehending because. Does anyone want to start why you think that might be?
I don't know that they're evaluating their text. They're not going back and rereading.
One of my greatest passions is to build leadership within those people that I work with, both teacher leaders and future principal leaders.
and gave back feedback right away.
So Friday
I
responses.
love that idea. I think the whole idea of feedback is so important, and if it's not immediate, it's not worth giving. Brian Starr, 20 to 50.
I better word no.
What'd you say?
Better word no.
That's awesome. Ow. Oh my gosh, Nina. 105, 149. We test our kids every month on how many words that they can read per minute. And you know what? Not to get into your private business, but if you would come to school more often, your score would go lickety-split up. I want my kids to know their number and when they've shown improvement. David Mackey, 42 to 67. Good job. Did everybody go up?
Yeah.
133. That's like 5th grade.
Good job, Daryl.
Good job, Daryl. Are you making fun of me?
Nope.
Oh, all right.
Hi, this is Diana again, and I'm going to do a sound check here to see if anyone can hear me.
Yes, Diana, thank you so much. We can hear you.
All right, good. Well, thank you everyone and greetings from the East Coast. In this video, I hope that you saw the different pods that came. I was trying to introduce those before the video started so that you could be prompted to, as you watch the video, look for the different roles and what people were actually doing, and then to envision what that would look like in your own setting. What was leadership doing? What were the very obvious moves that the principal was making? Who were the groups that were meeting together, and what did they bring to the table as they met? what was the nature of the dialogue that they had there. And what I'd like to do is encourage you to think about this in your own practice. What would that look like? What are the structures that are already present in your setting? Who is meeting with whom on a regular basis? What are the principals' moves in supporting that work? And how is the whole school focusing together on the work that cohorts of teachers are looking at? And I'm going to turn it back to Ellen now.
Thanks, Diana. I mean, that's really a compelling video, and Diana has many of those. Let me turn now to the practice guide, and we're going to do it in some different order. There are 5 recommendations that came out, and with any practice guide, what they've done is culled through a lot of research. This one had some 3,000 documents of research reports, journal articles, and so on and so forth, from which we determined 5 recommendations with action steps that educators could take, and roadblocks or challenges with some potential solutions. And the 5 are in front of you. One is the notion that data use is really an ongoing cycle of instructional improvement, and many of the ideas around data-driven decision-making is that it's an iterative cycle. The second one, and we'll touch upon this one much later in the presentation, is about helping students to become their own data-driven decision makers. The third, and this one's really at the crux, actually 3, 4, and 5, about enculturating data, is having a clear and explicit vision about how to use data and linking it to your educational objectives. The fourth falls right from that of what are the components that enable a data culture to take shape in your school or district, and finally about having some sort of technological data system in your education agency. And for those of you who may have heard Jeff Wayman give webinars for the regional lab, he speaks very eloquently about those kinds of data systems. So quickly just looking at recommendation 1, there are a couple components to it that you basically are collecting and preparing a variety of student learning data. And that could be anything from classroom-based quizzes and products up to formative, summative, interim, other kinds of assessments, as well as other sorts of data that can inform learning. You develop some sort of hypothesis about what's going on with the individual student or groups of students on how to improve their learning, and then you modify your instruction accordingly, testing hypotheses about what's going on, and then you iterate through that cycle. You may need to collect more data, you may need to reanalyze to determine the outcome and see what the next instructional steps are. Jumping over to the recommendation about the vision, and this is really, really essential. We can't emphasize this enough. There needs to be a consistent, explicit vision within the district, within the school building, about why data are being used, linked to educational objectives, if you have a school improvement plan, that sort of thing. And a couple of ways to work that vision is to provide for having a data team that sets the tone within the school, that you have ongoing expertise among a good cohort of educators on how to use data, and that could be a grade level data team, it could be a content level data team, it could be hierarchical or vertical. It's about defining the key concepts and the learning objectives and dealing with that within the vision and within the data team. Having a written plan that is explicit about the implications, the responsibilities, who's doing what are really important. And perhaps the most pervasive finding in the literature is needing leadership. As Jeff Wayman has often said, data use begins and ends in the principal's office. If you don't have that individual support, it's not going to go forward. So for those administrators, particularly those principals who are on the call, I hope you have broad shoulders because you have a tremendous responsibility there. But also the need for distributed responsibility because we know the mobility of educators that having the data team, having a data coach, and having building leadership really makes a difference. So a couple questions for you to consider, and again, looking at the conversations in the chat pod, so we know that you're being very active. Think about, does your school or your district have an explicit vision? And is that consistent throughout your district, especially when you're in a larger district? Is it consistent school to school? Is the superintendent saying something different from the principals? And how can that be aligned? It really is important, and as I've already said, is it aligned with your educational objectives? Moving on to number 4, and this falls right from having a vision, is that there are a number of components that are necessary to support building a data culture within your school. One is having what Diana calls a data coach. It could be a facilitator, a data champion, whatever you want to call it. And that individual works with the data teams to discuss student performance and other sorts of data to deal with various learning issues. It is helpful, and I know this is very hard in some schools and districts, is to provide dedicated time for the staff to collaborate. In one district where I've worked, Tucson Unified School District, they have what's called Wednesday afternoons out, in which there are no classes in Wednesday afternoons. Teachers get together for professional development and team meetings where the data teams sit down and mull over the data and deal with issues that are salient to trying to improve student performance. It's really hard. School day is long. It's difficult. I don't know whether you have common planning time, whether you could meet after school. Depending on location, there may be collective bargaining issues or union issues, but it is really important. And the final recommendation here is about having regular PD. One of the most salient findings in some of the research, and particularly something that was produced in 2009-10 by SRI and Barbara Means, is that you need ongoing professional development. It can't just be one-time hit and expect everyone to understand what you need to do, but sustained and regular ongoing professional development is really important. As I said before, leadership makes a difference. And just to give you some really quick examples here, the Kentucky Department of Education had a revolving door for chief state school officers when I was working there a couple years ago. I think they had 6 or 7 chief state school officers in a short period of time. They brought in a former superintendent from North Carolina who turned things around. He's a real data-driven guy. He's been there for several years now, and he has turned the department into a real data-oriented agency. He made a difference. Charlottesville, Virginia, where a new superintendent came in, wrangled a lot of old hats. A couple principals left because they didn't like what she was doing, but she hired on people who were data-minded, and she's turned around that district. Same thing happened in Tucson Unified School District. They know which building leaders are data-minded and which are not, and that makes a difference. At the classroom level, and in the District of Columbia, Washington, in the public schools, there's a concerted effort for educators to use data there. And in talking with a couple young teachers, they send their teachers out in the summer to do home visits to gather informal data about their students' home environment that they can use. And this comes from leadership at the building level and at the district level. So leadership does make a difference. Borrowing from Jeff Wayman's work, who has done a lot on principal leadership, and I'm not going to read through all of these. You all can get through them. He has identified a dozen different strategies of what a principal can do to make a difference. The reference for this work is at the bottom. and the URL. And if you have trouble finding that, I'm happy to provide the resource. But Jeff is very clear that these are important strategies to help principals lead in their building. That gives you a sense of the dozen strategies he uses. So a couple things, and particularly for the leaders who are on the call, some things that you can do. Model data use. If you're a data user, then there's a good chance that your teachers will take their cues from you. Communicate in any way possible the importance of data use, and one way is having an explicit vision. The other way is, as you're making public comments, use data. This is a big one, the provision for a trusting and open environment for discussion about data. An example being, if you've got a data team working and a teacher says, I'm really having trouble with a particular student, there should be no retribution for that teacher laying it on the line and saying, I'm having a problem, I'm failing with this student, how can some of my colleagues help? So open and trusting environment is important. Again, the provision for time for collaboration, the provision for data coaches, the release time. All are important things that a leader can do to facilitate the enculturation of data. Over to you, Diana, for the next video.
Yes, we'd like for you to take a look at, again, another example from a real school about how a principal and a teacher were sitting down and having a conversation about the teacher's students. And with the model that Ellen just went over, that's from years and years of research that Jeff Wayman has done and the research that we've done on the ground working in schools, as you look at those 12 indicators and those 12 elements of really effective leadership, I'd like you, as you watch this video, to think about, from what you're hearing both individuals in the video saying and referring to, what would you infer about the processes that have been going on in the past that are a part of their culture, the moves that the principal has made in the past, what the teacher has done, and what is the resource that they have in front of them that they are using to have this dialogue. So using their model, what can we infer about what has been going on here that made this conversation possible?
Take the lead and respond to the questions regarding CST data and your class performance and your grade level performance as well. Okay. What worked, what was effective, what you would do differently, and next steps for yourself as a leader and as a practitioner in the classroom, next steps for your team.
Absolutely, and I can prepare for that too.
I know you did.
Because they kind of go hand in hand, especially with only having 3 team members this year. My practice really relates into the work that we're going to do as a team, I think,
Correct,
too.
correct.
So the first thing that I thought was really amazing was this report, the score band graph that you can get off Data Director. So have you seen this before?
I have.
So what it is basically it's the same group of students I worked with last year, but this is their 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and then now 5th grade results. And so it was really striking to me. The math, of course, I moved a lot more students in math than I even anticipated. I had several students that were basic students that actually made it to proficient that I was not certain at the end of the year, even though all the interventions we put in place, whether they would make it or not. And anticipate the 4th graders that are coming into 5th grade are already going to be a lot more data savvy, just because of the work that I believe was taken on last year at an individual level.
Excellent point.
So I think the video will look, and the kids' behaviors will be different to drive that PD, basically.
Excellent.
So if I look at this, some kids picked advanced, and I was like, well, okay, so let's make your goal advanced, but I would really be pleased if you maintained, because 5th grade standards are more rigorous than 4th grade. And so when I look at this, and this is my English language arts, I believe. Yes. If they're in green, it means that they met their goal, meaning that they maintained. So it's kind of like they wanted to be advanced, but if they maintained proficient, I considered them meeting their goal because I knew what was coming and could anticipate that.
Okay.
So all the students that are in green met the goal that I expected them to be at. And if they have a plus sign next to it, it means that they actually, they changed bands. So Abdullahi, his goal was to be, remember Abdullahi?
Yes, I do. There are maybe 2 or 3 in each classroom, 2 or 3 of the students who had seemed to be making growth, but when it came to the actual CST, we didn't have the shorter cycles of monitoring.
Yeah.
And it goes back to your reflection, the daily exit slips, to make sure we hit it in every lesson, every day, to make sure that these 3 or 4 aren't falling and slipping between. Looking at the intervention efficacy, what was effective about that intervention, because now we have a group of 3rd graders in 4th grade that are in need. They can replicate that same process.
Yeah, most likely, yeah.
Okay.
I would think so. Looking at the 4th grade standards and just providing them that extra writing time.
Targeted intervention.
His parents really have to push him, like his homework's finished because his parents make sure it's finished.
Right.
And I was so working with other students that I was more concerned with that he kind of flew below my radar.
So what's your plan to address that?
I think
your plan and your team's plan. Holding on to the work you did last year.
Yes.
And that's what I'm reiterating to everybody, every teacher, is what we're doing is working. So how do we hold on to the best practices that are effective?
So the plan we have is to implement AR.
Okay.
First, then to go back to label with that language.
So it'll support your work with these instructional units you developed last year. Now, thinking about this year's students coming in to you, reflecting back on their performance and your team's goal setting. I know you already took your team through several meetings on what goals to set.
Yeah,
how many students per class,
Mm-hmm.
the 3 classrooms, the 3 5th grade classrooms, what their goals are, and how many students they need to move to reach your grade level SMART goal. You already did that work.
What's the role of the principal in your school with what you do in teaching?
I think it's about making the numbers and the data transparent, and that is the rationale then, is that this is the reality, this is what this data means, this is what it represents, and that the numbers have faces. And she is so good at then translating that reality and the data into a call to action and a vision. And she doesn't just abandon it. Like I've had experiences in the past where a principal's like, this is what we're going to do, but then it's never really supported or scaffolded for teachers to make that accessible.
Let's do another brief sound check as some of us lost connections. And if that happened to more out there, then please redial the audio connection again if you were on the phone line. In that video, I'm hoping that you were able to see some of the elements of effective leadership, both on the teacher's part and the principal's part, and we're able to infer from that that this is a continuous process. It's not a once-a-year event. It is something that is taking place on a continuous basis. It's clear from the interpretation, at least the way that I view it, having sat with many principals having this conversation with members of their staff, that this principal routinely is a member of the data team, whether it's a grade level team or a content area team. And the principal is aware of the team decisions and the team findings and is now having that follow-up conversation with a leader of that team with regard to her own class. And so from that, she's making some really good suggestions. She's asking some good questions. She's supporting that teacher, and together they are planning the next steps. And I'd like to give you some examples from some schools that we've worked with in the past around the country. Having worked with both large and small, and those that are also called really rural remote schools. And two that I'd like to share information with you about are the county school districts of Johnson County and Fentress County in eastern Tennessee, part of the Appalachian region. And both of these counties are among the poorest in Tennessee and had been given a regional distressed classification. And the schools there were among the most underperforming in the state of Tennessee a few years ago. They wanted to learn how to begin to use their data effectively. And this began when a small leadership team from the schools participated in a regional meeting that was held by the Appalachian Rural Systemic Initiative. And so a small team came representing the district and participated in a hands-on session with their own data to be introduced to a process and some thinking about their own data and what they could do in their own district. And from that first meeting, the districts made a determination that this was something that they were going to put in place district-wide. In Johnson County, the superintendent at that time was Minnie Driver, and the director of instruction was David Timms, and they made plans to implement the process in all 7 schools in the county, which consisted of 5 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and 1 high school. They put together teams from each that represented each grade level in each of the schools or subject at the middle and high school, plus all special educators, to participate in 2 4-day data sessions spread over time. And part of that professional development was learning a process of collaborative inquiry, how to ask the hard questions together as professionals, while at the same time beginning to develop their data literacy. As a team, they began to understand what they could learn from different kinds of data. We hear so frequently that we're now providing access to rich data sets, but teachers are overwhelmed with what there is and how to use it well. And in Johnson County and in Fentress County, the teachers there began to focus on how to use the different kinds of data and the importance of using multiple measures when making any decision and not making quick decisions. And more importantly, the teachers began to question their own curriculum, beginning to identify gaps in the curriculum or areas where their curriculum was not well aligned to the standards at that time. And they began to ask questions about their own instructional practice. So the focus turned around to not them, but us. What can we do about this? During the second of the 2-day professional development session that they had, teachers shared their data walls with a gallery walk, which enabled the entire county to begin a vertical conversation to determine the degree of vertical alliance or coherence in their curriculum and in their instruction across all levels, across all grades. And they began then to integrate this work with their curriculum work, with their own professional development in particular content areas, as they struggled with what is another way that we can reach our students. Now, some of the enabling factors here, and then, well, we've got the data up here, so let me just tell you in brief. One of the big challenges in Johnson County was the huge disparity, the gap between their students with disabilities and their students low SES, high poverty students. And so they were pledging themselves to close that gap. And within 2 short years, they nearly eliminated that gap. In this you're seeing here in reading and language arts, and they were consistently high performing in mathematics as well. One of the schools in Johnson County went on then to become a Blue Ribbon school as designated by the U.S. Department of Education. Now, some of the moves that the district made that made this possible was, for one thing, it was highly effective district leadership. They had a purpose, they had a vision, And it wasn't just talking about the vision, we're going to become data-driven. It was walking it so that real data was used whenever decisions were made, and as decisions were announced, the data was there to show it. The superintendent routinely shared stories throughout the district about the improvement processes that were taking place and the work that teachers and schools were doing. Dr. David Timms regularly supported getting timely and effective access to the data so that teachers were being able to put in their formative assessments and very quickly have a turnaround on that data so that in short time, during a common planning time, they could sit down and work with their data. In their smallest of schools, where there was, in some cases, less than one teacher per grade level, the whole school became the data team. And in that instance, being rural and being very small was a great advantage to them because they were able to get that vertical alignment conversation going very early. They wanted to be very transparent with the data. They wanted the data to be democratized so that at all levels people would have access to the data that they need. They put together a good structure for their data teams depending upon the size and configuration of the school, trying to use the existing structures rather than reorganizing things to support this work. They looked at what the existing structures were and how data could improve the work of those groups. And one of the big moves that they made was to make sure that whenever grade level teachers or content area teachers were meeting, that the special needs teachers were in the room at the same time, that there was richer collaboration going on between the teachers so that they were jointly reacting to the formative assessment data they were seeing and planning instruction rather than it being each person acting independently based on how they were interpreting the data themselves. So we'd like to ask you to look at your own structures that are in place. What is the configuration? How many different groups are teachers a part of? When do they meet? How regularly do they meet? Are they able to meet within the school day? Are the right specialists able to be at the meetings? Are administrators able to be at those meetings? Not that you have to be there every single data team meeting, but periodically meeting with those teams of teachers to be able to listen to their issues, listen to their evidence, offer guidance and support as they begin to make decisions about changes they're going to be making. What can I do to help you implement those changes? And then most importantly, and how are you going to monitor the impact of the changes that you're making? How will you know within the next 2 to 3 weeks if you're going to be successful and the changes that you're making are having an impact on student learning?
I guess that's back to me. So yes. What you gather from Diana's videos as well as her discussion is that you can't just go it alone. This requires many stakeholders to be at the table in trying to enculturate data throughout the school district, throughout the school, and even beyond. It involves the students, it involves the parents, it involves other stakeholders in the community. So, as they say, it sort of takes a village. Moving to the fifth recommendation about the data systems, and this is where it gets a little bit more challenging for the rural schools and the small schools. It may not be possible or feasible in terms of purchasing to have a full-blown data system or an instructional management system or an assessment system or a student information system, all of those big expensive systems when you only have a small number of students. Many people use spreadsheets as a way, so there are technological solutions that are possible. But you need to have a consistent and a coherent strategy for determining what are the best technological solutions for you. And a real key is trying to get not just the compliance and accountability data, but the real hands-on, real-time data that are going to be able to inform for classroom-level decision-making. So that's a really big and important decision. Data systems can be large, can be small, even in handheld computers. They're quite diverse these days. Diana, your data pyramid.
Well, the data pyramid is a tool that we use during our professional development. And it goes to that question about we have access to so much data that we feel like we're drowning in it, but we're not sure what to use and when. And so using a tool like this enables a school, from the district officers right down to the classroom teacher and all specialists on board, to begin to line up the data that they have and identify it by its relevance and importance in terms of what you can learn from all of the data, from each kind of data. And then, and let me just say, the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the pyramid here, represents the data that we get just once a year. The data that we can use to look at large trends over time and is good for some levels of analysis, and depending upon the state that you're in and what your assessment system returns to you, you can actually get deeper into the data to figure out for the class last year what were the high points, the low points, and begin to identify gaps in curriculum or instruction, but these are looked at over time. Getting down to the very base of the pyramid, the formative classroom assessments, which are those that teachers find the most useful and the most valuable. And that is often just the classwork, what you're observing students doing, whether you're using entrance or exit tickets, whether you're putting a pair of students together, asking them to complete something together and observing how they do their explanation, and so forth. That's the data that can be the richest source of information about, are they getting it, and are they getting it at the level to which we want them to aspire. One of the exercises that can be very useful for a school is to complete an inventory of all of the different types of data that you have available at each grade level in each subject. And this is a very telling experience for schools where primary teachers, kindergarten, first, second, third, will look at the overwhelming amount of data that they're collecting on an ongoing basis. And when they sit down to talk about who's analyzing it, is the data providing useful feedback, oftentimes they'll find out that they've got redundant data systems and that they're pulling information from something else, and they can often go back and eliminate some of the sources of data and still wind up with the information that they need and that they value. Creating an assessment plan like this, doing a data inventory, you can then turn it into an assessment plan, which can then inform your meeting structures through the course of a week, through the course of a month, through the course of each quarter and semester in your school, so that you're talking about which teams can be meeting when, so that they're timed with when pivotal assessment information is available and timely in terms of planning the next units of instruction. So whether you have professional learning communities or grade level teams, or perhaps you meet as a faculty periodically, this can inform the structure of some of those faculty meetings when each group of teachers would have relevant data that they've analyzed and then can report to the entire faculty, so that a whole faculty then can look at the data on the wall and determine for themselves, do we see any trends across the whole school? Is this something that our non-core teachers can assist with? So just from one document, creating a simple data inventory, it can evolve until you are creating an assessment plan, an analysis plan, and our cycle of instructional planning cycles, so that we know what formative assessments we're going to be collecting and how often we're going to be checking impact to see if our instruction is on target, rather than waiting until the end of the year. What you want ultimately to happen is to make it possible so that as teachers, we can sit down with our most recent benchmark assessment, formative assessment, classroom observation, and be able to create a short cycle instructional plan that is addressing the specific needs of students. One of the determinations that Johnson County made was that all cycles of instruction were going to be very short so that they were not waiting until too long to catch a problem, to determine where there was a gap or a set of misconceptions that a group of students were walking out the door with. So coming up with a short cycle instructional plan means that we are differentiating our instruction. We're learning that there's 4 ways to attack background vocabulary, or 4 ways to talk about evidence in a piece to support a conclusion in a research paper that we've written. So putting together a short cycle instructional plan where we target individual students or groups. We identify the specific concepts and skills and knowledge where we've determined there are gaps in instruction. And then as a group and then as individual teachers, we determine what strategies or actions are we going to do differently over the next few weeks to directly address the gaps that we've found. And then what monitoring tools are we going to use? What formative assessments are we going to embed in our instruction so that we're not having to stop and assess, we're not stopping teaching, it's embedded right into the instruction, and we're constantly surveying the landscape to see who's getting it and who isn't. And then at the end of the short cycle, we are documenting our results and what evidence was used to confirm that, in fact, they are getting it. Ellen, back to you.
Okay. I just want to play off of a couple things that Diana said, particularly about the pyramid. Many people will say, you've got to use the summative assessments. They're the most psychometrically valid and all of that. Let's not think about her pyramid as a hierarchy. There are many sources of data that are really important, and there may even be an inverse relationship between what is measurement valid in terms of that and what is instructionally valid. The most informative, as Diana just said, may well be at the base of that pyramid. So think broadly, and think broadly about the sources of data, because those that she just outlined in the pyramid and then in the subsequent slides are really about student performance. But to get a comprehensive picture of how a child is doing or why a child may be struggling really requires a broader view than just the assessment data or the student performance data to many other sources of data. So when we talk about using data and data literacy, we mean many sources of data, not just assessments. The final recommendation, we leave this to last because it is somewhat different than the others, is about really helping your students to use their data to help them understand how they're doing. And you could bring in the parents on this as well. And much of this is about helping the child to understand and set their own expectations, the provision for good feedback. And there's a very deep literature on what is good feedback, but it must be timely, specific, well-formatted, and constructive. There's also a whole thing about gender differences in feedback as well. But you need to provide that kind of feedback so the student can do their own cycle of inquiry around the data and help them to be their own data-driven decision makers. So providing things like rubrics and other sources and kinds of tools will help a student to acquire these skills. And one of the things about the feedback is that in terms of any sort of feedback, it needs to be tied to explicit educational objectives and goals with criteria laid out, whether it's in a rubric or some other document, what are the steps toward understanding and mastery and achievement. Trying to get across to the child as much as possible about descriptive and constructive rather than evaluative, so that you don't put the student on the defensive. And helping to think about making the data actionable to the student. So what are the next steps that they might do to move forward and progress toward their learning goal? The whole notion of formative assessment includes that inquiry cycle for the student with the teacher, sort of the moment-to-moment understanding of how they're doing, the proximal goals as well as the much more distal goals. So feedback is really critical in helping the children progress. So as we conclude, and I know we bombarded you with a lot of both the high-level and the in-the-weeds sorts of information today, and both Diana and I would be more than happy to follow up with more specifics, but we don't want to scare you away. This work is really not for the faint-hearted. One of the things that Jeff Wayman said in his webinar for the lab is that if people think about using data as an isolated event, they're not doing it right. Many people will say, we can't possibly do it because it's going to be so much more work than we have time for. And certainly, educators' time is really constrained, and that's why it gets the bad rep and the four-letter word designation. But if you think about really integrating data into everything you do, and good teachers have been doing this forever, it becomes a regular and integrated and enculturated part of your teaching process. So data, instruction, assessment all become an inquiry cycle. So rather than thinking of it as an event, oh, I got to go do my data, really think about it as that cycle of inquiry. And then maybe you won't need the lion having breakfast and chomping down on you as the overburdened educator.